Hello and welcome to our webinar about trade tariffs and planning in an uncertain environment. This is put on by Nickel Law. I'm Scott Nickel and here with Piwara Sapsuwan, and we're going to be discussing the possible trade tariffs between Canada and the US and steps that businesses can take to plan in this world of uncertainty to provide the best opportunities for themselves and to mitigate the risks that are present. We're both with Nickel Law. And if you need advice on this or other business subjects, please give us a shout. Our contact information will be at the end of this webinar. Also, as you may have seen, attendees are welcome to have a 20-minute no-charge consultation with us where they can discuss the concerns specific to their business. So I wanted to start off today with a quote, and this is by Leon Megginson, referring to Charles Darwin's work. And it is not the most intellectual of species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And we think that this is apropos for the current situation where there's potentially a lot of change that could occur in different industries and in the business environment and for different businesses with relatively little notice. So it's relevant today to be prepared, whether that's at a level of simply understanding your options or taking steps to make your business flexible and adaptable in a changing environment, to not only be resilient from change, but to be able to gain an advantage in it. We have to provide the usual lawyer disclaimer that the information in this presentation and webinar, as well as the questions and answers that follow, are for general information purposes only, and they don't constitute advice. Give us a shout separately for that. We make every effort to make our information relevant and accurate, but of course, it is possible that there are errors or other shortcomings. So buyer beware. So let's talk a little bit about the current environment. There have been tariff threats between the US and Canada, and the degree to which they'll be implemented and how they change is broadly uncertain. Both countries have threatened tariffs. Proposed rates have been 25%, but suggestions that they could be higher in the future. The basket of goods to which tariffs could apply has been something that's been changing. So, for example, the US proposed 25% tariffs across the board on all Canadian goods, but 10% tariffs on Canadian energy, while that was suspended for a 30-day period. Canada, in its efforts to retaliate, proposed a specific basket of goods, the details of which have not been released for tranche 2 of the basket, and which is also subject to change. That's also been postponed for 30 days, pending negotiations with the United States. So there's a lot of uncertainty about which goods will potentially be subject to a tariff, whether a tariff will be applied, how long a tariff might apply, and what rates might apply. So there's quite a few variables for businesses to try to tackle here. That brings us to a question about tariffs and who pays them. And as many viewers may know, a tariff is a tax on the importation of a good. At law, the importer pays them, but that story doesn't end quite there because economics will determine who bears them. And that could be the final consumer in the case of price increases, importers and subsequent supply chains, that's a result of higher cost and lower margin or demand. When you have a higher cost to final consumers and they simply wish to consume less of a product, as well as manufacturers and exporters external to the country that is applying the tariffs, and they may find themselves in a position to have to lower prices so that there continues to be demand, or simply experiencing lower demand for their goods. The result in any specific case depends on the market conditions for a specific good, as well as a specific supply chain and industry. There's not a one-size-fits-all. In some cases, it could be a matter of 100% is borne by a final consumer, up to 100% is borne by a manufacturer or exporter. In a lot of cases, it would be somewhere in the middle. So, questions on how we can manage exposure to tariffs. And probably critical to this is understanding your market, your industry, and the flow of goods from start to final consumer. To understand this, you want to really think about where goods and their precursors are manufactured, the tariffs that apply at certain stages, and we've put an asterisk in there because it also includes tariffs that might apply. So you may want to consider possible different future scenarios, as well as the value of goods at each stage. And an example that I've used quite a bit is the value of a shoe or a backpack that might be $10 of manufacturing cost and becomes $100 or $200 by the time it's in the hands of the final consumer. And at various stages, there's a value accretion that adds to that product between leaving the factory and landing in the hands of the person who will ultimately use it. So having information on how your supply chain works and the flow of goods from start to finish will help you navigate a changing tariff environment. Some of the considerations that apply in considering opportunities and risk mitigations include the likelihood of tariffs applying, the duration of tariffs, whether it's a brief shot across the bow as a negotiation tactic, or if tariffs are here to stay at some point. That may have an impact on the decisions businesses make. The scale of the tariff, is this a small tariff or a large tariff? The cost of measures, prophylactic or otherwise, that a business might take. For example, the cost of setting up a company domiciled in another country to manage its exposures comes with a certain cost, and that will be weighed against its potential benefits. And also the downside risks to a business if tariffs are applied. So considering all of these things in determining your response in a world of uncertainty is important. Okay, so now we'll talk about strategies, and this is a bulleted list, and Piwara and I will dive a little deeper into each one of these. So some of the strategies that can be used to not only manage risk, but generate opportunities include moving and stockpiling inventory at times of low and no tariffs. What that means is because tariffs are applied at the point of a good's entry to a country, you can simply move more of goods prior to the application of tariffs or prior to their increase. And once those goods are in the destination country, they generally can be sold without a further tariff applying. And this is something that has been understood to be engaged in primarily by medium to large companies who have seen that there's been uncertainty. There's a certain limited window. This can be done at any time prior to the application of tariffs, and it's subject to the uncertainty that applies. Of course, it's important to have somewhere countervailing considerations, and considerations on this option include a place to store goods, the possible risks and costs of storage, as well as working capital that could be tied up in inventory. Another option includes moving part of the value chain into a tariffing country. And this relates to US government statements about how tariffs will bring business back to America. Going back to the shoe analogy, if part of that value chain accretion, where the value being added to the shoe grows over time, if that happens in the tariffing country, it may come after the application of tariffs, and the tariffs may be applied to a lower value, earlier stage of the product, even if it looks physically in its final form. Remember that the shoe left the factory with a value of $10 and ended up in the final consumer's hand with a value of $100. If that shoe is tariffed at $100 and a 25% tariff, that would be a $25 tariff. If it was tariffed at $10 and a 25% tariff, it's only $2.50. So it may not be possible to immediately move value chains across borders, but there are many strategies that can be done to affect this. And typically both Canada and the US allow a company to be made to be owned by foreign individuals or companies, and to contract with foreign partners to provide part of its business operations. So in a lot of cases where a lot of the work done does not require physical presence in a country, a lot of the value may still be able to be done. But this again goes back to our slide a few slides ago about understanding your value chain and your product's flow from start to finish, because being able to determine for yourself what opportunities lay here will depend in what parts of your operation and how much value can be realistically moved across borders. And it is not possible or realistic generally to move 100% of the value. In some cases, that may be possible, but in many cases, it's not realistic, and fair determinations of value need to be made to mitigate risks on both taxing authorities as well as audits by tariffing authorities and importation controls. Piwara, perhaps I could have you jump in on reviewing agreements and some of the factors to consider there.
So I don't think that what's happening is unprecedented. We have been living through multiple unprecedented events in recent times. So given our experience from COVID, the transportation via the Suez Canal being obstructed, the war in Ukraine, and the anti-dumping and countervailing and human rights sanctions against certain goods being produced in China, our experience has been that parties that have ongoing agreements or parties that wish to enter into new agreements should probably think about risk allocation clauses and obligations in when reviewing or drafting their agreements. So some of the factors that you might want to consider in your agreements may include increased material cost, especially if you're in sectors that rely heavily on commodities that may be affected by tariff, such as steel, copper, aluminum, or lumber. And I'm thinking especially of the manufacturing and construction sectors. You may want to consider how the tariff may likely lead to higher prices for these materials, and also how these rising costs may affect the overall agreements. Also, you might want to think about delayed timelines if if you have any project agreements, supply agreements, or delivery agreements. And this is because tariff may make materials and transportation more expensive, and suppliers may need to find alternative, and this may disrupt or delay the procurement procedures. As well, you might want to also consider reduced profit margins. And from my experience, especially if you have long-term agreements, you might want to have an indexation mechanism for both labor and materials in order to better adjust the fluctuating profit margins and to hedge and future-proof your business. And also other clauses that you might want to consider are force majeure clauses. If you are an owner or a consumer, you might want to have a more elaborate explanation of what constitutes an unforeseeable event, given that an increase in prices and the imposition of tariff has been on the news for a while. You might want to be very specific in terms of what constitutes a force majeure event. And if you're on the other side of the project, i.e., if you're a supplier or a contractor, you might want to expand these force majeure clauses to account for, say, market shortages, labor shortages, or disrupted supplies, as well as another type of risk allocation clause that you might want to consider drafting very carefully would be a change in law and tax clauses. You might want to consider carving out tax and tariff as a separate matter to be dealt with, or including them under the change in law mechanism, depending on which side of the project or the agreement you're on. And other factors in the agreement you might want to consider would be, again, like Scott has alluded to earlier, supply chain flexibility and schedules. If there is any procurement or delivery involved, as well as, I would say, having a separate dispute resolution mechanism that deals specifically with issues arising from, or directly or indirectly from, the imposition of tariff, would also expedite any disputes that you may have vis-a-vis the other parties in terms of tariff.
Okay, and Piwara, if you had kind of 3 or 4 key points, what should people be looking at when they're reviewing their existing agreements with suppliers and customers?
I would first look at what the remedies of under the agreements are. For example, some agreements may have a relief event clauses that may give the supplier or contractor a some form of schedule extension or price increase. You might want to go back and review these items in order to adjust your agreement to the current climate. And another key factors that I think you might want to consider would be the I think just the force majeure clauses and making sure, like I said earlier, that that a contractor or a supplier within that sector ought to be reasonably aware of and able to anticipate such changes, and that you're not, and that if you're, let's say, a consumer or an owner, you're not being forced into an unwanted or unwarranted price increase. For example, if you have already agreed to a certain price before the tariff, but while the tariff has already been announced, but before them coming into effect, you would probably not want your supplier or contractor to be able to come back after the 30-day grace period asking for price increase, because these factors ought to have been foreseeable and taken into consideration when the original pricing is provided to you. So I think that these are probably some of the most important factors. And if you anticipate the agreements between the parties, especially if it's a cross-border agreement, to last for a while, maybe 6 months or longer, you might also want to think about currency exchange hedging agreements, or some form of indexation to prices and labor, as well as thinking of a venue of arbitration or dispute resolution that would be best suitable for cross-border disputes.
Okay, so what I hear is key points are looking at price clauses, force majeure clauses, any kind of currency or hedging that might be applied to existing agreements, as well as venue for dispute resolution, and where people need to go if they have a disagreement in an agreement in an existing supply chain.
Correct.
Another thing that businesses will want to consider is negotiating with their supply and distribution chain any kind of changes that might be needed. So as the environment changes, it's helpful to stay ahead of this, or current at the very least, with changes, and sometimes small changes can have a big effect. By helping keep everybody profitable, it can help people through difficult times, help businesses survive and maintain relationships through difficult times. In some cases, businesses may want to find new suppliers, or at least look for their availability. if one of the inputs may be subject to a 25% increase as a result of the application of tariffs. For example, it could be useful to find a supplier either domestically or in a different foreign country from which that tariff may not apply that can supply inputs to the business's operations. Another strategy that could be considered is price adjustment. If you're an exporter, it may make sense to adjust prices downward somewhat or to provide some tariff relief for your clients by adjusting price. And this may be an important part of retaining client relationships, including through periods of tariff application. It's not clear whether these will be permanent or temporary, but businesses may want to maintain their client relationships through periods of difficulty and, if needed, make changes at a later time. As well, we think that there's an importance to consider reinforcing relationships and communicating with your partners at all stages of the supply chain. Determination to work through any changes in the markets and work together, particularly if they're valuable components. Piwara, do you have anything to add to that list?
I would, I guess, I would probably add just being cautious and aware of what the contract amendment mechanism is in your, if you have an ongoing relationship with a business partner, as if there is a clear amendments clause, I think that would decrease the likelihood of the parties having to resort to lengthier means of negotiations, such as mediation or going to litigation over these preventable disputes.
So what I understand from that, maybe it's important for people to look at the duration of contracts as well as their ability to change them in the future, both for new contracts as well as existing contracts that they may be reviewing. And of course, these are all areas that are useful to get professional advice on, whether it's to implement changes or simply understand the environment in which your business is operating. So going to the next slide, we've got some opportunity for questions and answers. And the first question I see is, are there opportunities in these uncertain times? And I think I'll field that one and say, absolutely. There's every uncertainty and every challenge is a reason that businesses exist. And so the businesses that stay aware of their situation, stay current, and are well advised internally or externally, or whatever the case might be, but are well positioned as a result to take advantage of changes, can get a leg up on their competition. If your competition is subject to a 25% tariff and suddenly you're able to mitigate your risks so you have half the impact of the competitor, you suddenly became more competitive relative to your competition in the industry. So those are the opportunities. As things change, different parties will turn out to be successful or unsuccessful, and you want to navigate yourself to being the party of the business that can grow and seize on the opportunity of uncertainty instead of being harmed by it. And another question, what are some ways to maximize the benefits of tax and other governmental incentives to mitigate or to offset risks? I've got a few thoughts on this, and then I'd like to get Piwara's ideas as well. And my view is it's always important to understand your situation, to stay current on developments, and to get professional advice. And by understanding your situation, staying current on the environment around you, and getting professional advice, you can maximize your ability to take advantage of tax as well as government incentives. That's a broad world with lots of things going on. There's lots likely to change and be dynamic if tariffs, in fact, are applied, with some governments promising measures to support businesses through these times. And there's going to be quite a bit of information to sift through. Tax, and particularly cross-border tax, is a niche area that is complex It can have a lot of opportunities, but also challenges, and it's useful to get professional advice and to be prepared with a baseline knowledge of the opportunities or the options that may be available to you. Piwara, beyond understanding the situation, staying current, and getting professional advice, do you have other views on how to maximize tax and governmental incentives to mitigate or offset risks relating to trade tariffs?
I think be staying abreast of the tax benefits, or either in terms of import-export taxes that may be waived for certain equipments or machines or commodities that the government may have, or in terms of other tax incentives, such as in terms of training and labor and employment. Thinking something along the line of the tax incentive that the renewable energy sector has had over the past few years would be able to somewhat offset the increased cost that, say, any retaliatory measures that Canada may take against the United States may have on your business. So I think that is something to keep an eye on going forward, pending any announcements of assistance by the government.
Well, thank you. And this might be a question for Piwara, but what should businesses with ongoing cross-border agreements take into consideration to future-proof themselves, to the extent that that's possible?
Like I stated earlier, I think revising what type of events constitute a force majeure events, what type of events constitute a change in law, and making sure that the language in the contract is precise in terms of getting the parties to where they want to be and agree to be on, is very important. So some events or occurrence might not warrant change in pricing or a delay in supply due to its foreseeability, as well as some of the events the parties might want to have a different type of remedies that they provide for each other. So, for example, you might want to have a different threshold for each remedies, or for each occurrence. So, for X amount of price increase, you might want to allow certain events only, and for a different price threshold, you might want to allow a different set of events. So that's one way to future-proof an ongoing agreement or relationship that's cross-border. And another way to future-proof your business would be, again, to think about what the exchange rate fluctuation could how the exchange rate fluctuation could impact the pricing in your ongoing transaction.
Okay, thank you, Piwara. So another question that we have is, what issues do tariffs pose for supply and procurement processes? And I might field this one. Obviously, the immediate impact is that they're going to increase prices in those processes if they apply. And some of the price impacts may be unpredictable or applied subsequent to materials being ordered. So if some subassembly is being made in the United States and is imported to Canada, or vice versa, and between the time of contracting and the time of delivery, a tariff comes into effect, that could go up by whatever percentage is applied by the tariff. that can become difficult to establishing long-term supply and procurement processes. So even just the threat of tariffs can have an impact on those processes and relationships. I think it's something to be careful of, and that's why we've been discussing the risk management strategies today, as well as the opportunities to seize on uncertainty. And another question is, what are some of the sectors that could be hardest hit by tariffs? And I think the obvious answer to that is that any sector that's involving the physical transportation of goods across borders is subject to being hit. But more nuanced, want to look at sectors that have lower margins after they import goods. They're likely to be hit more than one that has a higher margin. Any businesses that are importing goods later during the supply chain as opposed to earlier. And in any sectors that have the ability to switch consumption from one area or one producer to another. And Piwara, I don't know if you'd like to contribute to that, and maybe you have some examples that you could provide.
I think that any sector that where if you look at the, let's say, a bilateral trade agreement or or sectors where a country take could rely on, say, a national security on grounds of national security or other lawful grounds under the existing free trade agreements to impose countervailing or anti-dumping measures against such commodities are probably the most likely to be impacted by the tariff. And so we're probably looking at just general commodities such as metal, steel, any, let's say, technologically sensitive equipment or oil and gas could be part of that, as well as foods items that are essential. Medical, for example, could be impacted. And also, I would also be cautious of sectors where goods are being manufactured in countries where the United States has or may want to take issues with, as we have seen with the example of, say, photovoltaic panels manufactured in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China over the past few years, or EVs being produced by Chinese manufacturers from third countries, for example. So I would expect that something similar might happen under the new administration. And if your supply chain relies on these commodities or manufactured goods, you might want to be more cautious.
Okay, and there's a question regarding considerations in anticipation of a cross-border dispute or dispute resolution, litigation, arbitration, and so on. I think key elements are any procedures provided for in an agreement, in a trade agreement, the jurisdiction provided for, and it's also important to consider prerequisites for claims, as well as any time requirement in which a claim must be filed. Those are often jurisdiction specific and involve or require the knowledge or advice of a professional with knowledge of the jurisdiction governing the trade agreement. Many agreements may also be governed by a convention for the international sale of goods. I think that's going to bring it to a close for today. We don't want to take up too much of people's time today. If you have specific questions about your business's exposure or opportunities and structures, changes, or other things that you can do to mitigate risks or provide for opportunities in a changing environment, we'd be happy to have a free, no obligation consultation. We provide advice in Canada as well as for cross-border and international clients and clients doing business both inside and outside of the borders. I'll put up our contact information, and this slide deck is also available if you want to drop us an email. We're happy to send you a copy. Once again, I'm Scott Nickel, and this is Piwara Sapsuwan, both with Nickel Law. We're here to help businesses succeed. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.